Hello, everyone. I'm here to discuss with you William Butler Yeats, our first modern poet in Brit in the second half of Brit Lit. So, just a bit of general information about Yeats. One thing that he's fairly known for is some of this. He uses a wide variety of symbolism to kind of imagery that's almost dreamlike, and presenting his poetry. And as if you read the introduction, it talks about how he vacillates at different points in his career. He has different themes that he touches on, and some of that reflects his own progress as as a human being, and as a poet. Especially the last two poems we read had to deal with old age and how to cope with that as well. But as it says in the introduction, he had come to be interested in various types of mysticism, folklore, theosophy, spiritualism, Neoplatonism, and I think you can actually see Neoplatonism, which is basically uh, more of a neoclassical philosophy of that goes back to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato and his ideas of ideal forms, beyond the realm of the appearances of the natural world. In fact, a lot of modernists, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, will return to neoclassicism and partially rejects some of the emphasis on nature and emotion that you find in romanticism, um, and more emphasis on rational classical forms. They say that at the same time, that's not necessarily what they practice either. I mean, you do see a lot of classical forms, especially in Yeats, with Leda and the Swan or Sailing to Byzantium, kind of classical references and more. Um, and you even see that in their politics and kind of the ways that they are more right leaning. Um, in fact, it talks about Yeats being interested in fascism at one point, and there was actually a lot of sympathy from a lot. Ezra Pound actually got tried for treason. Um, Ezra Pound is an expatriate poet from America, and he actually got sent back to after spending time in places like Ireland and England. He was actually he actually worked with Yeats at one point. He got tried for treason back in America because during World War I he actually supported the Italians, and would speak on the radio, and would give addresses, um, in Italy that kind of supported fascism and things like that. So even in as we'll see with poets like with T.S. Eliot, you see kind of a leaning towards more sympathetic with kind of elitism, kind of an aristocratic view of art, and you kind of see that with Yeats as well. At the same time, Yeats is also kind of a contrary figure because he's very anti-nationalist. At the same time, he had a lot of acquaintances and friends who were very nationalist. As an Irish poet, Yeats, there's a lot going on with the relationship between England and Ireland. In fact, there's been a long history, as we see in Easter 1916, about about how subordinate Ireland is to the motherland. Well, I guess in this sense, the motherland, England. But there were movements, and some of the friends of Yeats were Irish nationalists who wanted independence for Ireland. In fact, 1916 is to commemorate a tragedy that befell after a failed uprising on April 24th, 1916, by these Irish nationalists, and some of the leaders were executed by Great Britain. So it's a very, and Yeats is kind of at a crossroads as to what type of attitude he's supposed to take towards this. And in the poem Easter 1916, you have an elegy, or more elegy or eulogy for the dead. It mourns the dead, and it emphasizes remembrance of them. In fact, if you look at the form of the poem, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the first and third stanzas have 16 lines to commemorate the year 1916, and then there's 24 lines in the second and fourth stanzas, to kind of tie into the idea that this took place on April 24th. And then the poem itself talks about the poet's own acquaintances with these people. He says, "I have passed with a nod of the head or polite, meaningless words." Nothing. He hasn't necessarily engaged them. In fact, when he talks about his acquaintance with them in their dreams, he says, on page 2094 in starting on line 9. And thought before I had done of a mocking tale or jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. So he didn't take their ideas too seriously, because to wear motley is to be the fool or the jester, and so he thinks when he's listening to them and having their acquaintance that their talk of is fanciful and too far fetched um, to um, to be taken seriously. But as the last two lines of this stanza and all the stanzas after indicate that they're, well, with the exception of stanza 3, there is, he says all, that kind of attitude after this event is changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. In fact, it almost seems to promote Irish nationalism in this poem. I mean, he recounts some of his acquaintances, and you get the footnotes for like Constance Gore Booth, whose voice in Revolutionary, there's a contrariness between different temperaments that they have. Like her voice grew shrill, but at the same time she has a voice that is sweet, young, and beautiful. And also with some of his other friends who have come into force. He might have one, talks about some of his poet friends who he even says he might have one fame, so sensitive is his nature, and yet so violent in his revolutionary fervor to take his philosophy to action, for his friend to take this into action. And he even commemorates, if you read the part about his crush on Maud Gonne. It talks about her estranged husband, and even though he detests him, he still, he too has been changed into and transformed, utterly a terrible beauty is born. So he's still even commemorating him and his role with the uprising. And then you get the symbolism in the third stanza for sure. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone. And the stone appears to symbolize the idea of revolution, the idea of a free state that they cling to trouble the living stream or the state, and the living stream can come to mean the state itself. The worst that comes from the road, the rider, the birds, the range, from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. So all these things change, but that stone still, certain trends change. Like a shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. So the nature of it changed, but the idea remains there in place, which is why he ends the stanza saying, in the midst of it all, there's a stone. And the last stanza kind of reflects on just the history of Ireland. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. And there's always, if you go back to writers like Jonathan Swift, you see the evidence of what kind of tensions have existed between the Irish and the English for a long time. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart, which kind of also ties back to the symbol of the stone in the previous stanza of revolution, and and the cost for clinging to those ideals of revolution and freedom. But he's not necessarily saying that, he's not being extremely patriotic. He's actually debating with himself. He says that when may it suffice, the sacrifice, when will it be good? And he says that is heaven's part, our part to murmur name of, so he leaves it to heaven, to whatever fate may happen, as to what will become of the struggle. And he says our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep last comes on limbs that had run wild. And basically that's kind of a way of saying, by murmuring name upon name, is to remember, those who died in the attempt. In fact, he says, what is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? In fact, he questions, like, was this for nothing? In fact, he actually had he spent some time as a resident of Ireland for a long time, but there were also intervals in his life where he went to England, and he actually tried to merge a lot of what England valued with Ireland. And you see his debacle here, like he says, for England may keep faith for all that is done and said, talking about their independence, because as the footnote says, there was a home rule for Ireland into law, but with the outbreak of World War I, that was revoked. And Yeats seems to be questioning, like, would they actually honor this? If they would honor it, then that uprising was for nothing, and they died for nothing. So he's torn. We know their dream enough to know they dreamed and are dead, and what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? And then he just gives the names of the people who he's remembering. Now and in time to be, wherever green is worn or changed, changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. In fact, one of the things that happened, they executed the leaders of this uprising, and one of the things that actually had the opposite effect of what they were hoping as far as setting an example of what not to do. Instead, it actually consolidated, the movement and made it even more tumultuous and arose more upheaval. All right, so if we turn to page 299, we look at one of his more famous poems, "The Second Coming," um, which is based on the Christian myth of the second coming of Christ, but it's not necessarily fully Christian in nature. It's a little bit more. It goes beyond just being, something of a strictly uh, Christian poem, and actually ties into more of his idea of history. When he talks about the Jaira, and if you read the introduction, it talks about how he has this conception of history that you know meets where theses meet antitheses, and and history as a cycle that that comes and features something prominently, but then changes. Guard. In fact, some people have interpreted this poem as kind of signaling the end of Christianity and something else coming to take its place as far as the ages are concerned. And yet we still have Christian language. Turning and turning the winding gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. If we think of terms of modernism and alienation, and even more so than the Victorians, they almost seem completely, there's no master anymore. There's nothing there. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So there's no order anymore. There's nothing to fall back on. So you're left to the. Unlike Victorians, you still held out hope. Usually that there is a guiding deity and guiding religious sentiment. It seems almost lost in Yeats's poems here. The blood-dimmed tide. In fact, this is all very figurative. It's not. I mean, it's responding to things like World War One. Certainly, that has just passed, and there was a lot of carnage there, and a whole generation wiped out. But it's almost taken and embodied symbolically. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So, pretty, almost kind of an abreaction to the event of the war. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So it's a world of chaos run by corrupted men. So it's certainly a much more pessimistic poem about the times compared to, you still had some skepticism in the Victorian times, like if you remember Arnold and Tennyson, but here it's just completely almost pessimistic. In fact, except in the next stanza, he tries to tie it into some kind of revelation. Surely some revelation is at hand. It's almost kind of a wishful thinking, a hopeful thing. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. So he tries to look for comfort, but it's denied him. Somewhere in the sense, in fact, you get kind of almost an archetypal image here of a sphinx. A shape with the lion body and the head of man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. And it moves towards, Bethlehem. The 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by our rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Which might, and it's ambiguous. Some people have tied it into being, something of a reaffirmation of Christianity, since, as the footnote says, that the second coming of Christ is heralded by the beast of the apocalypse, but we don't, or the Antichrist, but we don't see that in the poem itself. We end with a question, which means that maybe we're left with just some, ravenous beast that's going to tear apart the world. So not very optimistic in that one, or at least it's ambiguously so. Okay. The next poem, Sailing to Byzantium, is just kind of we get into these last two poems, which are kind of reflection on Yeats in his old age. He's 61 years old when he's writing. He's like 60 or 61 years old when he's writing this poem, and he's reflecting on his state and what he hopes for his soul, his soul to what's to become of it in the end. In fact, the first stanza even says, "That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, the birds in the trees, those dying generations, which they eventually will die. At their song, the salmon falls, fish, flesh, fowl come in, and then he ends, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. So in youth, everyone's kind of neglectful of the fact that they will age and die. Of course, he's more cognizant to this because he's getting on in years and he's getting older. In fact, it's in 1939 when he actually dies. So he still has barely over a little decade. So in fact, he even says, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, which is a reference to Blake, as the footnote says, and louder sing for every tatter in its moral dress, nor is there singing school but studying, monuments of its own sin. In fact, he imagines kind of this spiritual journey to the holy city Byzantium. He feels himself getting old, so he wants to go to a place where his soul can actually still live on, apart from the youth. In fact, he says these sages stand in God's holy fire, consume my heart away, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal. He wants his soul to be, liberated, to be vital, without having to, be caught in the, I guess, the corporal suffering of being embodied. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity, which is an interesting kind of phrase to say, artifice of eternity, because especially in the last stanza, he kind of emphasizes how his idea of eternity, or where he imagines, he fancifully imagines his soul going, is completely full of art, in a way that's not. And it's a little ambiguous because of how it might not be genuine, but at the same time, it might be, some kind of imagined bliss. Once out in nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and golden enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past, or passing, or to come. In fact, you can almost tie that kind of metapoetically to the idea of his art living on, and so that's how his soul lives on, is through his poetry, singing of the past, present, and future, as a go- as a as a golden bird, as the footnote kind of intimates. In fact, he also talks about how if he could live in any ancient civilization, it would be that of Byzantium, which is modern day Istanbul, but used to be a Greek settlement. Okay, probably one of the harder poems, I think, of the collection I gave you is Among School Children, where Yeats at one point was a senator of Ireland, and this kind of recounts a visit he did to a Montessori school, where you have a contrast between the youthfulness of the children and his, 60-year-old smiling public man, which is himself. And this poem gets kind of dedicated to Maud Gonne again, a woman who he had, was enamored with for years, and she never returned it back. But he always dreamed of her. In fact, he kind of almost makes it almost kind of a metaphysical poem. In fact, in the second stanza, he talks about how he dreams of the Lydian body. If you think of the myth of Leda and the swans, it's supposed to be, Leda was supposed to be so beautiful that Zeus transformed himself into a swan and raped Leda, who would then give birth to people like Helen of Troy from, the Odyssey and the Iliad. Actually, not the Odyssey, wrong one. Let's see. In fact, he talks about that change, some childish day to tragedy told, and it seemed that our two natures blent into a sphere from youthful sympathy. And some people have read this as him imagining, his soul and Maud Gonne's soul coming together, but it also seems to tie into the disparate state of his old age and, the youth of the children as well. I mean, that might be another argument I could see. In fact, he talks a lot about the effects of time in stanza 3. I look upon one child there to the other and wonder if she stood so at that age. It almost becomes, kind of imaginary nostalgia for even, if she looked as young as they do and as lively. And there, in fact, he's, says, my heart is driven wild, and she stands before me as a living child. So this all goes on his imagination while he's making the rounds, talking to the nun and talking to, and visiting the children. But now, in fact, in the stanza 4, he kind of contrasts that vision of her as a living child with the hollow cheek in the mess of shadow, that took a mess of shadows for its meat in her old age. Yeah, and so there's something almost kind of frightening about the fact that you can't recover those times. That aging is a process that can't be stopped. In fact, he even ends better to smile on all that smile and show there is a comfortable kind of old scarecrow, which kind of intimates a fear of getting old and dying, and never having never having that relationship requited. Okay. In fact, he goes into more philosophical terms, like in stanza 5, where he imagines a mother with with a child upon her lap, and he questions, would you know would think, did she but see that shape with 60 or more winters on its head, a compensation for the pang of his birth, with the uncertainty of his setting forth? And it talks about the pain from labor. In fact, as far as was it worth it to go through that pain to to have a child whose path in life is uncertain, and the fact that he'll just grow old and die anyways, which seems a little futile. In fact, he tries to turn to some philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras, but even they don't, they are too old clothes upon old sticks to scare a bird. They could have all these grand ideas about the nature of life. Plato has his theory of duality, which is mentioned in this verse about a spume that plays upon a ghostly paradigm of things. So the truth behind appearances. Then you have Aristotle, who sees truth in things itself. And then you have Pythagoras, about his mathematical basis for musical intervals. But nevertheless, they still grow old. Old clothes upon old sticks to scare a bird. So despite all their fanciful musings or their philosophies, they aged and died. Well, I know. Yeah. Let's see. In fact, there's a contrast between. Well, there's a refocus about nuns and mothers who worship images, whether it's children or that of statues. Um, and yet they too break. So they look to these things to give them peace, and yet you know both those idols and both children break hearts. O presences that passion, piety, or affection knows, and that all heavenly glory symbolize. O self-born mockers of man's enterprise. And that's talking about the nuns and mothers, because it's they give life at the same time that that life's going to die. So that aging is inevitable. In fact, yet there's something to be said in the last stanza where it says, labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born. Labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair. Which is, in fact, these are kind of odd phrases, because that's usually how, the body is not bruised to pleasure the soul, and it's usually the bruising of the body that strength. Sometimes it's said to strengthen the soul, or beauty born out of its own despair. O chestnut tree, great rude blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the trunk? You can't separate the parts from the whole. O body swayed to musical brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? And a lot of this, it's a very ambiguous ending to the poem, and there's been various ways of looking at it, especially focusing on the terms blossoming and dancing, which are, one is growing life and one is showing the vitality of life. And yet, all that stops. In fact, I think one of the most powerful lines in the poem is the last one, where how can we know the dancer from the dance? Like, if you think of, it almost starts to become existential as far as, you can't separate the dancer from the dance, in the sense that the subject becomes the action itself. So yeah, those are some of the ideas running through the poems. And again, among school children, is a more difficult poem. Okay, this has basically been a discussion of Yeats. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me.